I'll pass over to Wendy without further ado to do the introductions and welcome to country. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending our Community Resilience Forum, which has been run today for the communities of the south coast of New South Wales. Farmers for Climate Action warmly welcomes you all, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting and stimulating series of discussions today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet in this virtual capacity, the Yuin people, and pay respect to leaders past, present and future, and indeed the traditional owners of all the lands on which we live. Farmers for Climate Action is an organisation which works with farmers and their communities across rural and regional Australia to shine the spotlight on the need for climate action. We work with farmers to build climate literacy across communities and advocate for farmers taking climate action. Ours is a grassroots movement and we work closely with farmers to identify and implement measures on and off farm to tackle climate change and empower communities to work with low carbon solutions, adaptation and mitigation strategies to help create a sustainable and thriving rural and regional Australia. When we speak of community resilience and the power of a connected and strong community, we really need look no further than the communities of the south coast of New South Wales. Across Australia, we've witnessed your resilience in the face of the most confronting and terrible crisis over the summer. The bushfires are a stark reminder of the devastating impacts of climate change, and your response has been a vivid and compelling demonstration of what a community can achieve to overcome the most horrific challenges. And now with the COVID-19 crisis, you are again showing that you are resilient and innovative and are connected. And Farmers for Climate Action is helping bring to you some expert advice and practical steps to support your response and recovery. We know that you have the answers, and we're really honoured to be able to work with you in part to help elevate your resilience and power as a community. Dr. Rob Gordon, Greg Mullins and Denis Ginnivan will lead fascinating discussions today, and I really thank them for their time and expertise. I'd also like to thank the team and board members of the FCA attending today and acknowledge, I believe that Fiona Cotvoys is, who is potentially running for the seat of Eden Monaro in the upcoming by-election, may also be on the call. I'm not quite sure whether she's been able to join us yet. So thank you for joining us, Fiona, if you're there. I know that our farmers and those attending the forum today are very passionate about climate change being a key issue for all the candidates in the upcoming by-election. After the speakers, we'll be touching on some ways that you can connect even more within your community and demonstrate your support for building even stronger call for action for our leaders and our thought leaders and influencers and policymakers to address climate change. Enjoy the forum. I know it's going to be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah.
Pete, can I just ask, are you able to post the link to Slido in the side again, just so that we've got it there for everyone? And
all right. Just a minute.
Code so they can join.
Slido is hashtag resilience. All right, so put a space in it. All right, so that's in the chat box, and there we go. All right, now for those that can hear me, can somebody answer me? Because it looks like I might have locked up again.
Yeah, hearing you fine, Peter, thanks.
Right, fine. Thanks, Robert. Right, I'd like to introduce Professor and Dr. Rob Gordon, who is our clinical psychologist this morning. He is vastly experienced in disaster recovery, working in the St Mary's, Black Saturday fires, and various other disasters, which we won't go through now. But Rob is going to explain to us, which I think you'll find interesting, about how communities are impacted, not just the citizens of those communities, and how we might endeavour to understand that and try and put the community back together, and in that process build our resilience. So I'll hand over to Rob now. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody. As Peter mentioned, I started working with bushfires after Black Saturday when I was part of a children's hospital team, and visited the Macedon area for 4 years on a periodic basis. Halfway through that time, there was another very large fire in central Victoria around Maryborough. And so I found myself visiting 2 communities that were 2 years apart in their recovery. And that's when I started to get a sense that there were certain commonalities going on in the way the community process unfolded. And I thought there must be certain basic principles driving this, principles of the way human beings respond to trauma and stress. And that set me on the path of trying to develop an overall model that would guide us to understand what happens, how are things going to unfold, what can we predict, and more importantly, if these processes are predictable, they should be manageable. And so that led me to do something I hadn't been taught to do at university, and that was go away and read a lot about social theory and community processes and so on. And it shows me that what goes on in our mind is embedded in a larger community, and we have to understand this. So I want to present to you this, just in an outline way, the way in which we can predict any social unit is likely to respond when it is impacted, could be suddenly or could be slowly, like in a drought, with a intense, threatening and unusual event. I think the more we can understand these processes and recognize what's driving them, the better we can actually then manage the processes by what we do in the community. There's an American researcher called Daniel Aldrich, who's researched disasters, having lost everything he owned in the Hurricane Katrina. And what he's shown with very big studies up and down the coast of Japan and in all the areas affected by the East Asian tsunami, that the one factor that most accurately predicts not only the speed and adequacy and completeness of recovery, but also the death rate in the incident is not political influence, the amount of money spent on recovery or infrastructure, but social capital. The measure of the degree to which the community has established connections and groupings and self-help groups and information transmission groups on their own basis. That's the thing that most accurately predicts. And this is showing us that the essence of recovery is community process. And I want to try and provide some of the things I've learned about this in the last 30 years or so I've been working with this. Now I'm going to share my slides and we'll have a bit of time to discuss these after the presentation, but please feel free to raise questions as we go through. Now, I hope you can see that. Can everyone see that? I'll just have to work out which way it's going to show up when I put it onto display. Now, can someone tell me whether you're seeing the one slide or the 2 slides?
We're seeing 2 slides at the moment, Rob. It was,
right.
was a little bit bigger in the previous.
So that should be the right way around.
Yes. Yep.
Good.
Looks pretty good.
So if we start with the community before the disaster, communities are highly organised. And these dots represent the members, and the lines are the, let's call them the social bonds that connect them together. So this could be an area in which there are little towns, or within the town, it could be people that are grouped around particular interest groups, etc. Now these connections, these affiliations, if you like, in groupings, help to tell us who we are. And so we show this by the colouring. I'm sorry that that disappeared so quickly, but it's a glitch that no one can seem to solve. So we got this sense that we've got all these different groupings, but that's only one dimension. Let's say that's a grouping showing political interest. But if you take another dimension, you'll find that you feel much closer to people in, let's say, a neighbouring town about climate action than you do to your next door neighbour who mightn't agree with it at all. And then we could take many other dimensions which all have their own organisation, in the sense that we fit together with those people that we feel something in common with, we interact with them, we feel closer to them around that issue, and we somehow learn to live in this complex multi-dimensional environment where we've got socioeconomic status, we've got occupation, we've got education, we've got political interests, religious views, cultural views, etc. And they're all interlocking, and somehow we get to know where people fit. There have been studies to show that if you map the way people understand their position in relation to various issues in the culture, and you do that across a whole group of people in a particular cultural group, they all have a remarkably similar mapping. In other words, we have a common picture of a culture. And so what I'd like to present to you is this idea that we've got a kind of multi-dimensional, let's call it something like a crystal lattice, that draws people into relationships and allows them to feel close to each other in some dimensions while being far apart in other dimensions. So that we've got this complex tapestry of connections in many dimensions. And where we feel far apart from community members in one dimension, we'll have a commonality in them in regard to other dimensions. And that's why the community holds together. And as long as those similarities and differences compensate for each other, we've got this sense of a functioning community. It's got its problems, but it holds together. Now, the fundamental organizer of this community is, through legislation and norms and customs and culture, is as best as possible to put survival off the agenda. In other words, I heard, I was on Southeast Radio, ABC, this morning doing an interview, and the item just before them was a bit of a discussion about a local bridge that needs to be replaced, and whoever it was from the local government, I think, was saying we'll be doing some work to prop it and repair it and make it safe until such time as we can plan and put in a new bridge. Because the assumption is you can drive across that bridge without your safety being threatened. The function of communities is to put survival off the agenda, so people can go about their business without wondering, is this bridge going to collapse? Am I going to make it home tonight? When that fails, there are a lot of questions. There's a strong feeling that various people must have failed in their jobs if driving a truck over the bridge causes it to collapse. So that the stable structure and its rules and operations is to put survival off the agenda. We've got specialists to deal with survival: firefighters, police, doctors, plumbers, etc. And the rest of us can just get on with what we want to do. Now, here's the problem. A disaster, by definition, is something that brings a community-wide impact that confronts the members with survival here and now. We cannot delegate it to the designated people involved. We have to deal with the fire ourselves. Now that means we suddenly drop out of this complex web of relationships. They are irrelevant. It's me and the fire. It's not that I won't help the people around me, anyone who's in my vicinity, but what will determine it is my physical contact with them. And evidence shows that we do much the same, whether it's our nearest and dearest or someone we've never met before. It's the physical opportunity that determines a lot of our behaviour. And so we have this sudden challenge to the community that cannot be dealt with in its normal processes. The only way that could happen is if the whole community functioned as an emergency service, but it doesn't, because normal life puts survival off the agenda. Now that means the bonds that we don't normally think about, the connections, the attachments, are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the fire. And so here comes the fire. Here we've got on the left here, we've got the Liberal voters, and here's the Labor voters. And they don't like to talk to each other in normal circumstances. But as the fire comes through, they change colours. They all change to be orange because they're all not Liberal voters and Labor voters, but fire-threatened people. And here's the Collingwood barrackers and the Rabbitohs barrackers down here. And you see that as the fire comes through, it doesn't matter who you barrack for or what code you're in. And as the fire goes through, people actually do their best to survive, given the immediate physical circumstances. And if you talk to people, and some of you may even have had this experience, as you go through it, everything condenses into the here and now. I live in a fire-threatened community from Black Saturday. We were surrounded by fire. And sitting there on the hill when it goes pitch black in the middle of the afternoon, you just feel keyed up, and the only thing that exists for you is the smoke. Can you see the flames? What will we have to do? And so on. Everyone sort of contracts. It's like the visibility is a picture of the social contraction, everyone into their own space. You wonder what might be happening, but you don't have any connection with people in other places. Now, I call this the moment of debonding. We debond from the connectedness to our social fabric because it is irrelevant, and we are in an extremely heightened state of arousal, and we are ready for anything. And that's what's shown by the dark red dots. We're all the same. We're not this complex multi-dimensional person with all sorts of interests. We're only one thing. We're a survivor. And that is an unstable state. We cannot function outside as a connected social unit. If you investigate the psychology of sects and of brainwashing, you can see that if you disconnect a person from their community and their families, they actually start to fall apart, and they have to bond to the sect or the captors in the case of brainwashing. And this becomes a very deep damage that takes a lot of work to change. And so this moment of debonding has the possibility of being destructive, but in normal communities, it stimulates an enormous rebound. Now, the important point about debonding is that it disrupts the sense of continuity, of connectedness, but it's unfamiliar. Therefore, it's neither recognized nor understood, because what it does is affect everything I normally take for granted without thinking about it. All the things that I don't consciously experience, but being my sense of place and value and identity. And in that state of heightened arousal, we are in an intense self-focus. And that self-focus, there's been a lot of research on this adrenaline state over the years, and you actually lose awareness of what you've lost because all of that attention goes into your relationship to the threat. And what I've learned through many bushfires throughout Australia and New Zealand and other disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, doesn't matter what you talk about, the psychological experience is the same, whether you're hiding in a room from a gunman or whether you're in a bathroom waiting for your house to blow down in a storm. And the important point is the reversal of this debonding is neither automatic, immediate, or complete. It requires a certain social environment to bring that about. And that's really what the task of rebound and recovery is. Now, it's an unstable state. It doesn't last long. To begin with, everybody comes together, but some people will probably leave the area, but those who stay will begin highly animated, intense communication with each other, where everybody's talking to each other about everything. Well, not actually about everything, only about the immediate circumstances of the disaster. And so what you see here is a social system that has lost the differentiation and organisation it had before, where I knew I talked to this neighbour about football and that neighbour about politics and this neighbour about climate change, and we all got on well. But in this case, our life is very simple. It's who survived and who needs water and where are your horses and have you found your stock and so on, where you're going to sleep tonight. So I call this the state of fusion, where all of that organisation has been lost, and you've got this sort of, instead of a crystal lattice, a plum pudding, and it's highly energised, and anyone who's been through this would know what the first day or two feels like. Now, what I notice is that, like any social system, that will rapidly form a boundary around it, and that boundary forms within hours already, days. And it's very important that the representatives of all the service providers are embedded in that fusion state as the boundary forms. Otherwise, they actually have to puncture the boundary in order to come in. And then they're experienced as foreign bodies. And I could give anecdotes about small communities where local government didn't make contact with them maybe for a few days or sometimes even longer, and expected them to come to the local area centre. And they actually form this cohesive unit and begin to look after themselves and feel a very strong animosity to the surrounding authorities. It's of course doomed because they can't supply for themselves, but there's this sense of we're forming our own identity. And the positive side of that is that people actually bond together to actually help each other. But it's a social system that is entirely devoted to the experience of the disaster. And you can see the different identities are starting to reform, but they're no longer in their organisation. No one's thinking about politics or climate change or anything else. They're just totally in the here and now. And so this fusion actually requires to be pulled apart to create the new multi-dimensional social fabric. I think of that as a process of social differentiation, so that the fusion is not the basis for the future. The new organisation that has the opportunity for closeness and difference and creative processes, that's the basis for the future. So that you've got what I think of as a process of differentiation required that will draw this plum pudding back into a complex structure. And for that, we need a transition process to a new sustainable structure that integrates old and new structures, serves recovery needs, focuses on being a new future. But now here's a really fundamental principle. What I've noticed and what I've gone away and read about is that there's a very strong finding in social theory and experimental psychology, which shows that if, you know, it's even there in rats. If you put too many rats in a cage, what do? They start to eat each other. If you have people in a social unit that is poorly differentiated, doesn't have enough boundaries or enough organisation, it's been known for years that the default way in which that organisation comes about is through conflict, hostility, antagonism, competition, and negative emotion. Unless we come in with an overarching organisational principle that helps people find out where they fit and how they come together. And in that plum pudding, we've got the seeds as time passes for conflict and negative emotion to open up. And this can be seen to start happening as soon as the differential impacts of the disaster starts to show up. In other words, the different ways in which people are affected. We all thought we were together, but hang on a second, I find you've been given a handout which I'm not eligible for, that you've been given a delivery of hay that I've missed out on. You've actually saved your house, I've lost mine, and so on and so on. Even two people have lost their houses. The house means something different to each person. One person has a new, well-insured house with new furniture. Another person has a small cottage that's been in their family for 3 generations, full of heirlooms. You cannot compare the experience. But we think we can in that state of heightened arousal. We're just looking at the external. So what happens is, I call them cleavage planes erupt. So here we can see the social bonds joining people here. And these people start to realize that actually these people have got some kind of grant that these people don't qualify for. Now, if we were all rational and calm, we'd say, oh, that's unfortunate. Yes, I can see that the terms of the grant allow you to get it, but I don't. That's not how it happens. And there's often in the plum pudding circulating of rumours about what people should get or shouldn't get, and whether they have been affected or whether they haven't been affected. No one really knows, but everyone's got a strong opinion. There are many problems with hay deliveries when people think somebody has been donated hay when they don't deserve it. In actual fact, nobody knows, but they bought the hay. And so once these gossip and rumours start to be transmitted along the communication lines, when the various people hear about it, they say, I'm deeply hurt, I'm not going to talk to that person again. And this ruptures the social fabric. By the same token, if we give aid in an insensitive way, it will separate people. We give it, it qualifies some people and disqualifies others, and it breeds resentment. And there are many stories where long-lasting feuds and bitterness exists because of what people got or they didn't get. So we can see that as time passes, the fusion is not adapted because it's based on the myth that we all have the same experience. And if we don't get in there and start organising very early, this process just keeps on going. And it goes on throughout the recovery if we're not careful, creating ruptures and cleavages and rifts, because its function is actually to produce a new differentiated social system in which we can find a place for ourselves. But it's doing it through destructive means. And this is one pathway of differentiation. So the cleavage planes have a function to differentiate groups from each other and help them find their position. It does according to the way the differences are perceived. It cuts across pre-existing structures because they're built on ordinary everyday life principles. It alienates subgroups from each other. They don't talk to each other. It fractures support systems. It impedes planning and decision making. We get a lot of cases where this has gone bad, where people don't want to sit in the same room with people that they're angry with. And so you can't actually start to work together. It politicizes what actually should be a psychosocial process. They go to politics or the media or whatever, and then things get embedded in the long-standing problems instead of the community coming together. So that I want to emphasize this because what I notice is that a lot of the irreversible damage that occurs to individuals, to families, to communities doesn't occur on the basis of what happened on the day of the disaster. It happens over the next months and years as these cleavage planes cut across and embitter people. And you can find this in case after case of disaster recovery throughout the literature. There's a lot of case studies in the United States and England from their various disasters that show how destructive this process is. But the principle is, if this need for psychosocial differentiation is managed through shared communication and changed structures adapted to the needs, the cleavage planes lose their function because we've got constructive processes helping people find out where they fit and why they didn't get this grant and how they can compensate for some other form of assistance. And the core of that is this idea of forming some kind of community-based advocacy group that then can begin to develop a disaster recovery communication system shown by these green lines. And this principle of community representation and advocacy is enshrined in the National Recovery Standards. Because if you think about it, normally governments of all sorts only provide very restricted assistance to their community members, and usually only small numbers of the community get any substantial assistance, because it's a principle of Western democracy that governments keep out of people's lives as much as they can. But after a disaster, they're going to need to be involved in a very intimate and complex way in people's lives for quite a while. And there's no basis in normal functioning of governments to do that. So we need additional feedback and attunement from the community. So the communities have to come together. So this is the Community Recovery Committee or the Community Resilience Committees. And hopefully the differently affected groups here have got together and have got a connection and a representative to advocate for their particular needs, so that all the various parts of the community get a say. And this recovery committee connects up and works with local government, state government on the whole redevelopment process. So it's finally attuned to the realistic experience and history and needs of the community. And that then leads us to the reforming of a complex, stable crystal lattice based on the new future. It'll be different, but it'll have to have some commonalities. So this constructive differentiation is supported by a few principles: community participation, validating emergent groups, new communication structures to serve recovery, a common fund of information that will constantly bring people to common ground over the cleavages, actively managing social tensions, inequalities, misunderstandings, because they will become a community event, and most of all, consistency in relief and assistance. Now, I've portrayed this as though it is a sequence of phases. Life isn't that tidy. It's a series of processes that spin off each other, but it doesn't go in a straight line, and the circumstances may mean that one community spends a long more time in cleavage than in differentiation, and another community gets onto the recovery committee quickly, and so the differentiation is more constructive. And when I've worked in drought affected communities and presented this, they've said to me, we recognise all these processes, but we see them all happening at the same time. And that leads me to this diagram, where you've got a kind of steady state. And if you follow this through, you can get copies of these slides. You can see that debonding will always lead to fusion, but if threats and survival needs come up in the fusion, people will return to debonding, and they can go from cleavage to debonding, and from cleavage to differentiation, and differentiation can break down to debonding, and so on. So you get this sense of lots of processes going on, and I think these ideas, for me anyway, provide a bit of a framework to map. If there's conflict, what's the issue? Is the issue related to the past history? Is it related to how recovery is being done or not done? It'll show a need that then can be thought about in terms of a constructive process. And so it's a steady state that comes and goes according to the circumstances. We have just a few basic principles. Preparation and planning reduce debonding. They won't eliminate it, or we wouldn't really have a disaster. The degree of debonding determines the degree of fusion. I've described it as though it's all or nothing. It's not. It's a whole range of shades of grey. The community may be very well prepared and barely debond at all. I think that's the case I've heard in cyclones in Western Australia, where they're very practiced. They've got all the buildings to codes, and they all just go and sit in the bathroom for a couple of days and then come out and start cleaning up. But you know that we're always going to get some kind of debonding for a while. The fusion is the major cause of the problem, not the debonding. It's the fusion, which is an unsustainable alternative social system. The cleavage planes are based on perceived collective differences, but information about what we have in common, our commonalities, in spite of the differences, sutures them up. And I've seen this happen in meetings where people have complained and been angry, and then somebody brings forward what we've got in common and why these differences are there and how we need to work together. And you can see the bonds start to form again. Circulating information promotes communication, which facilitates bonds, and common action creates constructive differentiation. And all of this has to be done through forming groups. Now, we can break this down, and I won't go through these points in detail. We can maybe ask questions about it. But we've got strategy 1, which is prevent or terminate the debonding. And in other words, bring people back into community as quickly as possible. The longer we have debonding, the more destructiveness is likely to occur. Second strategy, minimize fusion. And there are a series of simple strategies we can use to get in there early and help to rebuild organisation and structures and recognition of difference. Third, expect to intercept the cleavage planes. They will come. We need to constitute a community sense organ that will pick them up early and feed them into the community groups that can start to think about how to manage them. And then get structures going and opportunities to meet so that we can stitch together the cleavage planes, suture them up by bringing people together in common experiences. Symbols and rituals are particularly important. And then finally, promote constructive differentiation right from the beginning, running through this. Now, in my last few minutes, I just want to say a few words about the role of arousal and stress in recovery. And I think this is very important because this is now talking about what's going on for the individuals in the middle of this process. The first basic principle is we have this graph that shows us something fundamental. Here's how well we function, our performance on this vertical axis. Here in the horizontal axis is how aroused we are. So we're not aroused at all. We may be depressed, or maybe a little bit more we're bored. And then as our arousal climbs, our performance climbs until we get into our comfort zone. And in this area, we kind of function on a day-to-day basis. We can use all our skills and do pretty well. But if the arousal keeps going, then we start to get into stress mode. And stress means I'm actually trying to deal with more than I can cope with. So I've got to actually shut some things out and put the focus on the things that are absolutely essential. And the higher the stress, the more demand is put on my system, the less I can hold everything together until we get right down here and we're getting to the point of trauma. Trauma means wound. And this is when the system's starting to break down. And finally, we get to the bottom where the arousal's so high we can't function at all. Now, if you take that principle, then what we find is the first state we go into is the emergency mode as the fire comes over the hill, which functions with adrenaline. And adrenaline floods us with reserves of energy and reorganizes us to focus on the here and now. It activates the right frontal lobe where I think in pictures. And so I have these flashbulb memories. We have very simple pre-programmed emotions, or in fact, we try just to go into action mode. Here's a picture of guys in Adrenalin rescuing a woman from a cinema fire. And if you look at this man's face, you can see the narrow focus of his attention on the task of evacuating. They haven't waited long enough to get this woman in a safe position. But if you have a look at the faces of all these men in Adrenalin, this guy's got a lot of the effort, but you notice this blank expressionlessness in their face, intense, focused, but unexpressive faces. And that shows you that there's no emotion, it's all action. But if we were to stop them and prevent them carrying out their action, all of that arousal that's going into the action would suddenly feed back and convert into emotion, as it has for this bystander. And you get this relationship in this state of action versus emotion. And we know that when we're rushing around adrenaline state and people try to stop us, we'll fly into a rage, or we'll burst into tears, or we'll be in this very emotional state. And so when people know what to do, they just go into overdrive. When they don't know what to do, they dither, they get confused and they can't plan. Now, that only suits the immediate threat situation. Once the fire's out and we've got somewhere to sleep that night and we've got things in hand, we move to the second state, which is a different state. It's the endurance mode. This is the state we go into, not when I've got an immediate problem, but when I've got a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do about it today to fix it up. Like, I can't rebuild my house this afternoon. In fact, I can't even fill out the form this afternoon because I haven't got it. I've got to wait for it to come, and so on. So we go into this state where we start to plod through, and this is the state that people are probably still in now, a lot of them, just going through the clearing up of their blocks and looking at how they're going to rebuild and what are their financial circumstances and how will they get building permits and the advice about what the BAL ratings are and so on and so forth. And so what we see is that people get into this plodding state. They can't do it in that right frontal lobe, just action mode. They've got to use the knowledge that is already there in their mind. But in this state, you can't solve new problems. You can't come up with new ideas. You tend to fall back on what's familiar. And there's the problem, that we haven't built houses after bushfires before. So we're trying to find our way through, but we're not in the right state. Here's a picture of I call it the cortisol endurance state. It's a different chemistry. These poor people have been held hostage by Filipino terrorists for 6 weeks. And you can see the similar blankness showing their high arousal, the intense brightness of the eyes, but there's nothing to look to. There's nothing to do. And if you have a look, there's a loss of the sort of implicit communication, the signaling that helps people keep in touch with each other. You can imagine that this married couple will probably need quite a bit of help with their relationship after they spent 6 weeks in this endurance mode. Well, it could be how a couple is in a farmhouse that's been burnt and they've lost all their fencing, etc., and they don't know how they're going to get through. We don't have, in this state, the leisure to be emotionally responsive. And so what I want to emphasize is that this is what's paralleling the cleavage planes in the social structure, is that this state of stress means everyone becomes egocentric, focused on my problems. And it's very hard not to feel that I need the help and to actually say, I better reach out and find out what's happening with somebody else. We all get too full. And so during this period of recovery, this is the state people are in for the longest time. And there are just a couple of points to notice about this. In this state of stress, our problem-solving thinking is reduced, our ability for verbal thinking of concepts, planning, etc., lateral thinking is reduced. I'm going to jump to emotional associations rather than logical deductions. And that doesn't help me solve reality problems. It's very good for emergency survival, but it's not a basis for long-term planning and sustainability. Farmers have told me that decisions they made in the early period after the disaster, when they got a year or two down the track, they realized were poorly thought out and all that work had to be redone. At the same time, in this high stress state, we've got pre-programmed instinctive emotions going, and we don't have the complex, meaningful, socially organized emotions that allow us to have compassion and understanding and resignation and regret. And that keeps us all reactive and emotional. And of course, you can see how this feeds into the cleavage planes. And I'm going to react when I see somebody get some hay that I feel I should get, etc. And this leads to judgments. Now, there's just a couple more points I want to make before we bring it to a conclusion. But these are a simple set of principles about talking to stressed people. And whether this be neighbours or your partner after a bad day, or the service providers talking to community members, or working in informal support systems. I know that rural areas develop these peer support systems from one farmer to another. The basic principles are these. When you see a person's in this stress state, and you can hear it in the way they talk and their anger and their frustration, don't try and do any business before you bring their arousal down. Get them back up to the top of the curve. How do you do that? Just listen to them, be upset and angry and complain for a long time, and go with them. Help them, instead of coming in and saying, look, that's not reasonable, ask them to clarify. Or how did you find out about that? Or where did that happen? Or do you know where the hay came from? Etc. And do it in a way that is slow and methodical and explains all the reasons, and you unpack your own thinking processes so that you lay out the logic with them and pause between sentences so they can take in the new ideas. You know, instead of going with them and getting very excited like I am trying to get through all this stuff in a short time. And people have told me that it is so soothing to have someone talking quietly and calmly, even if you're yelling at them and they just keep talking back to you in a quiet way. It just slowly brings you out of it and you realize what you're doing. Now, because, and we don't have time to go into it, but we now understand what's going on in people's brains when they're in this high stress state. And the effect of cortisol and adrenaline to a different degree is to actually shut you out of the top left-hand corner of your brain. So you're operating in the right mode where I can do anything that is familiar and I can visualize, but I just can't take in these big complex words and I can't think things out. You know, probably you've all had the experience of trying to fill out a form in unfamiliar language. Actually, people have a lot of trouble filling out the simplest forms in a relief centre after a bushfire. And they've just had a life-threatening experience. But it's the same for me. If you ask me to try and do my tax at the end of a busy day, I don't know what all the words mean, or a letter from an accountant. I can't make any sense of it because I can't get into the right part of I know it's in English, but I can't work out what it means. And I feel helpless. So they're using words that they don't think are jargon, but they're English words that they use in a particular way. I would use them in another way. So try and avoid any jargon. And I reckon the important guideline is at about the age of 9, children start to work with concepts and reasoning and complex ideas. That's when they move from sums about apples and oranges to algebra. Remember algebra, A plus B equals C? They're concepts. So a good guideline to talk with stressed people, and you'd need to do that with me if you're going to talk about farming or accountancy on a bad day, talk to them using the complexity of language that you'd use to explain your ideas to an intelligent early primary school child. Don't talk down to them or treat them like a child, but just, it's a communication task. If you can put the simple words in, more sentences, unpack the reasoning, then people will understand it. Don't make assumptions. And then you start to build it up. And the difference between a person who's gone from one person to another and not been understood, and suddenly somebody's listening, they start to feel, I'm connecting. And that's the bond coming in. They'll form a bond to you. Now, just a couple of final points. One is the idea of resilience, which is bandied around. It's often bandied around in a way that I notice annoys people after disasters, because there's a simplistic notion that you should bounce back, you should just get on with it. But actually, when I followed this meaning of this word from the English dictionaries to the Latin dictionaries, and from the Latin to the basic idea behind the Latin idea to spring back, you come to this word sale, which means reeds. As soon as I saw that, I thought that's the essence, isn't it? Because reeds get flattened by the flood. Don't you guys wish you had a flood? But then when the water recedes, the reeds come back, whereas the trees get washed out of their roots and away. And I think it's about, resilience is about hanging on to the most important qualities of our life that become the core of our future. The quality of life, meaning, values, relationships, community. These cannot be replaced. They are the essence. That's what we need to focus on. We need to go into bricks and mortar and finances and all the rest of it, and and agronomy and fences, but you must put first the quality of life and relationships, because it's no good having a new house and a farm and your marriage is breaking down, or your children are off the rails, or your health's broken down. And so therefore it's so important that the relationships are preserved, the social fabric is preserved, and we can build everything on that. And that means putting an equal focus on those things to the practical issues. And finally, we come to this set of contributors to resilience that come out of the research into resilience. Moral compass, flexible element. I won't go through them all, you can read them, because actually when you think of what's going on in the cleavage planes, in the fusion going into cleavage planes, you've got a destructive process, which means you've got a choice between resilience or desilience as these negative processes open up to an ongoing process that degrades the quality of people's lives over this period. And so this is what I think the first 6 to 9 to 12 months is about after disasters. With droughts, it's ongoing, and so it's a matter of actually trying to prioritize all these things as just the whole system slowly gets worse and worse. Look, I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks, Rob. That was very interesting. There are a few questions. I'd just like to say there's a very interesting line of discussion in the chat box, in the Zoom chat box, which we'll try and save somehow. Not exactly sure how that works, but people might find that interesting. As Rob might have to go, just a couple of questions have come through repeatedly. What is the impact of isolation due to COVID-19? Presumably this will make communities very debonded.
Yes, thank you for that. I've been asked a question a lot. If you think about it, isolation is a sort of a low-grade debonding, isn't it? It's not a complete debonding, but it's a let's say degrading of the bonds, erosion of the bonds, and we can keep in touch electronically. But what we lose electronically is a lot of the implicit communication, the you know, the body language. I'm trying to use my hands. You probably can't see them, but you know, the tone of voice and so on. A lot of these things reduce that amount of communication, and we have to set up a communicational event and so on, so we don't have that spontaneous contact we have and see someone in the street. So I think that makes all of these processes much harder. We probably have to be more thoughtful as to how we design webinars and making sure people have access to it. And it's going to restrict it enormously. Actually, as one of my young clients said to me, a young adult who's you know, working on his thesis at university, after a couple of weeks in this, he came along one day and said, or came online one day and said, I understand now why solitary confinement is a serious punishment. He's of course at home in his flat by himself, but supposedly writing up his thesis. So I think it's very important that people retain self-awareness. And there's one other point I'd make on this, and that is that what I notice is that this isolation process seems to degrade a person's sense of self in a subtle sort of way. I think we preserve our sense of our value and our quality and who we are from a lot of those interactions. You know, you're walking down the street and someone waves to you across the road and says, "G'day, Rob, how you going?" And I realise I must be a nice person, mustn't I? If I have an underlying bad mood and I get that wave, I thought I was miserable, no hoper, but actually somebody thinks I'm all right, and you get a few of those, and by the end of the day, you're feeling better. It's boosting my identity. Well, if I'm at home and no one rings me up, I just go, you know, down and down. So I think it's a funny thing that some people feel threatened in their identities, and this is really an issue between the introverts, the people who take the meaning of their lives from within themselves. They're much more liable to be, you know, okay. Well, you know, some people are saying, I love this lockdown for a bit of peace and quiet at last, nobody bothering me. And then the extroverts who, you know, interact with everybody actually feel more and more restless and feel they're going crazy. I need to talk to someone. And what I notice is in organizations, there's a conflict between the introverts and the extroverts. The introverts are working at home saying, oh, at last I can get on with my work and get a bit done. And the extroverts are sending them emails all the time with trivia and jokes and annoying them because they want some interaction. Well, I get interaction all right, but not the interaction they want. And so you get these tensions growing. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening in families. But I think the underlying thing is we actually maintain our sense of who we are from spontaneous communications. In other words, communication I don't ask for. It comes to me spontaneously by the interactions I have. And so I think one thing we can do is just create more opportunities where we actually initiate communication and tell people what we think of them, or just don't tell them, but just treat them as though they're interesting. So that'll be, you know, something that hopefully it's going to start abating. But I think if it were to keep going, we're probably going to need to be more deliberate about this sort of thing.
Okay, there's some other questions there which we will deal with at the end. We're running about 15 minutes late, and I know our other speakers have got commitments as well. So thanks, Rob. We'll ask these questions at the end if you're still around.
I'll probably have to tune out in about 5 minutes, unfortunately, for this today, but
right.
I'll be able to stay the distance for the next lot.
No, well, that's all right. Well, people might like to tune in to the following forums next Tuesday to get some questions as well. Just given that you are going, then there's just one that I'm not entirely certain about what it means, but somebody has asked, is the anger, etc., that comes from destructive differentiation also similar to lateral violence? I have no idea what lateral violence is, but anyway.
Yeah, I think that's violence within the social system, rather than to the, you know, to the government, to the breakdown. Yeah, I think you could say that's a concept that's coming from a different sort of frame of reference, but I think that's the point at which the connections between people within social systems leads to friction and violence. Yes, that'd be another way of talking about it. That's there in society anyway. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Rob. Now, I'd just like to introduce Mr. Greg Mullins. Are you there, Greg?
Yes, I am.
You are there? Good. Well, all right. I'll just get over here a bit. Right, so Greg, many people would recognise after the bushfires. Greg's had a long career in firefighting as a volunteer, and well, he's retired now, but as the Commissioner of New South Wales Fire and Rescue, and is now working with a number of organisations on the impact of bushfires and climate change, or climate change on bushfires. So I'd like to introduce Greg, and he will run us through what his view of the future might look like and what happened, and he's open to questions after that. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everyone. And Rob, that was really insightful. Thank you. That was amazing. Look, before I start, I'd just like to say that there'll be a number of you who've suffered loss through these fires, and I just want to acknowledge that loss. I hope that nothing I say triggers anything. I will be talking about the fires and the impacts of the fires. So, yeah, my heart goes out to you. I was down at Bateman's Bay fighting fires on New Year's Eve and fighting fires throughout the state prior to that. And I have some insight into what you've gone through, but not from a personal perspective. So I know you're doing it tough. Someone just said, can I change the lighting on my face? No, I'm in a room with bad lighting. Sorry. This is as good as it gets. And you can't see all the blotches on my face with it like this anyway. What I'm going to talk about today, I'll talk about how bushfires are changing, impacts of climate change. I'll explain that as best I can in a short period, and what that means to disaster response and preparedness and resilience. Little bit about me. I started fighting fires in 1971, was my first big fire with my dad. Grew up on the northern beaches or northern suburbs of Sydney, surrounded by National Park. Dad was a volunteer firefighter for 63 years. So my earliest memories of him was just heading off, looking out over the hills at orange glows and wondering which one Dad was trying to put out. So I started fighting fires as an early teenager with Dad. By the time I was in the Bushfire Brigade, as it was called at the time, by the time I left school, did my high school certificate, I knew what I wanted to do. So I went into the fire brigade, full-time fire brigade, 1978. I was commissioner for just under 14 years and retired in 2017. And I went back to the Bushfire Brigade where I fought so many fires with Dad. So I'm currently a deputy captain at Terry Hills and a deputy group captain for Northern Beaches Rural Fire Service. So I've fought a lot of fires this year for the last season: Casino, Wollombi, Howes Valley, Blackheath, Warragamba, Bargo, Bateman's Bay. And I've studied bushfires in Spain, France, Canada, and the US. So been to a lot of fires. Now, so a bit of background. So the New South Wales bushfire seasons had always been cyclical. I remember growing up, my father would point out certain wattles and different things that would flower early, and he'd say, gee, it's probably going to be a bad year. It's warming up quickly. These shouldn't flower until a month later. We better get prepared for a bad season. But about once every decade, you'd get a bad fire season. You'd get fires just about every year. Some years were wet, but the bad seasons were around about once a decade. And if you look at the Blue Mountains, 1925-26, 1936, 1944, my dad fought those fires. 1957, Lura was burnt out. 1968, lots of homes lost. 1977, I fought those fires. 1994, and then something strange happened. 0102, 2007, 2013, 2019, 20. So it went from about once a decade to once every 6 years. And that's a bit of a canary in the coal mine. I'll come back to that. Fire seasons in Australia shift progressively south. They start in Northern Territory has a season in winter, but then Queensland, often starting in August or sometimes July, mainly southeast Queensland, shifts south to the northern tablelands of New South Wales, then to central New South Wales, then the south coast, then Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia. And what that meant, the progressive onset, was that fire services could share firefighters and equipment, aircraft, fire trucks. So we're able to, as one fire season finished, we could move on and help another state. Now, historically, most big fires that cause property losses happen on 1 or 2 days in a spring or summer. You look at Black Saturday in Victoria, 16th of February, I think it was, 2009. Ash Wednesday. So these days have names because it was one day of really bad weather. And in New South Wales, that was pretty much the case too. So most of our bad fire seasons over the last century or so were preceded by drought. And they also coincided with an El Nino event. And I won't go into that, I don't have time, but I think most of you know what an El Nino is. Generally hotter, generally drier. So that was a thing. Now, our previous worst fire seasons have all been in the last 2 decades, or 2 or 3 decades. So 1994, 206 homes lost in New South Wales, 800,000 hectares. 0102, I think it was 126 homes lost, 744,000 hectares. 2013, 222 homes lost. That's not counting 52 in Coonabarabran in January that year. and 118,000 hectares. Then we come to what we've just experienced in New South Wales, 2,448 homes lost. So it's 1,000% increase on our worst ever year before this, 2013, and 5.52 million hectares. So you're talking scales of magnitude, and I'll talk about why shortly. So when did things start to change? For me, it was 1994. I was in charge of the Lane Cove National Park fire. Then I worked in the Blue Mountains, Terry Hills. So that went for weeks. Now, what was remarkable about those fires was they did go for weeks. They started up around Grafton, and we got many days of what we called extreme fire danger in those days, which is now could be severe, extreme, or catastrophic. It just went on and on. We had blocking high pressure system stalled in the Tasman Sea. That's not unprecedented, but the thing about 1994 was no one saw it coming. And I remember my dad saying, this blindsided me. We'd actually written off the season in November because we got fairly heavy rains in Sydney. But that's another feature. When we get rain, it's normally very heavy. Most of it runs off and doesn't soak in. So that's another issue I'll come to. We had what I call savage weather, strong winds, very low humidity, very high temperatures. You get this incredible evaporation, and the Bureau of Meteorology call them drying events. So you don't need a long run up to get a bad season anymore. So predicting a bad season is very, very difficult, because all you really need is 3 or 4 drying events, major drying events. So temperatures above 35, relative humidity around 10 or less, and strong westerly, northwesterly winds. It dries everything out, because underlying all this is a 20-year drying trend. There's just not the moisture in the landscape that there used to be. And I'll get onto that. So what are we seeing? Hotter, drier weather, more days of very high fire danger and above, and longer seasons. So let's dig into a bit of detail. So what is climate change doing? And I don't have sufficient time. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to try and impress you with references and everything, but if you're interested, please go to the Climate Council website, climatecouncil.org.au. Lots of papers, some of them I've co-written with people like Professor Leslie Hughes, Will Steffens, Professor Will Steffens, and the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action webpage, which has a link on the Climate Council. So we've got all our submissions to the Royal Commission, New South Wales Inquiry, etc. I think you'll find them very interesting. They're all referenced. So bad seasons, as I said before, bad fire seasons are now more frequent. They're not once a decade. They can be every 5 or 6 years now in New South Wales. If you look at Victoria, far more losses historically in Victoria than in New South Wales. So 2,000 homes in 83, 2,029 homes in 2009. So historically, they had very bad fires in 1898, 1939, 1983. So about a 50-year turnaround, 40, 50-year turnaround. Then 26 years later, 2009. Now, you can't say that's statistically significant at this stage. It could be an outlier, but it's looking like their very bad seasons are compressing. Tasmania, I think, is a canary in the coal mine. Bad seasons, 1898, 1939. I'm doing this off the top of my head and I've forgotten most of them, but they're about, again, 40, 50 years apart. And then all of a sudden we got to 1997, which was within the range. 1967, most of Hobart burnt, 1,600 homes, I think 62 people killed. 1997, big year. Then 2006, 2013, a couple of hundred homes lost, Denali. catastrophic fire danger. They've never had fire danger like that. 2016, the World Heritage Areas that have never burned before, burned. So pencil pines, things that aren't adapted to fire were subjected to extreme fire. Thousands of fires caused by lightning. And talking to Mike Brown, former Chief Officer of Tasmania Fire, Tony Blanks, former head of National Parks Fire, they can't remember in their 50-year careers ever seeing a fire caused by lightning in Tasmania, but now it's regular. 2 years later, 2018, again, World Heritage Areas. So things are changing. In 2018, we had subtropical rainforest in Queensland burning. So things are really, really heating up. Seasons are much longer. Now, on the South Coast in particular, Bureau of Meteorology have actually done an analysis of the Tathra bushfire in March 2018. They haven't released this because there's coronial investigations still going on, but I might get the number wrong by 1 or 2 days, but they've found that the South Coast, New South Wales South Coast fire seasons compared to the 1970s are up to 111 days longer. And this is in our lifetime. This is remarkable that you can have such a shift within a human's lifetime. It just shouldn't happen this quickly. So, and you would know down there, Bega Valley, 2018, August 2018, early 2018, I remember emergency warnings at 6 a.m. in the morning as the westerly came in. There were fires burning out in the hinterland, and a couple of homes were lost in the Bega Valley, Ulladulla, and then up to Newcastle, Port Stephens. So our fire seasons are starting in New South Wales in August now, sometimes July, and I'll talk about why that is in a moment. But the old Bushfires Act 1949, the Rural Fires Act, enshrined 1st of October to 31st of March. That's the fire season because that's 100 years of observations. That's about when it lands. So that's this is Australia-wide. The seasons are getting long. A bit less of a trend in West Australia, southwest West Australia, but still lengthening. Now, the problem with that is that our seasons overlap. And I talked about sharing firefighters before. So what happened this year? We had a lot of help early on in northern New South Wales from the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, Country Fire Service in South Australia, Tasmania. We had them from all over. They all had to go home because their states started to burn. And this is what is happening increasingly. We're getting overlapping fire seasons, and that's reducing our ability to deal with the biggest fires. I was in California in November at the Kincaid fire up north of San Francisco. I've fought a lot of fires in California over the years. Got some good relationships with fire agencies over there. Their fire seasons are almost year round now. They don't talk about the fire season. They just talk about the year when our worst fires will be because they have fires all year. That's a direct relationship to climate change. They don't get the snowpack that they used to, so they don't have the moisture. Bark beetles that attacked the pine trees or native trees used to die off when it snowed. Now that it doesn't snow in a lot of areas, those beetles stay alive, they kill the trees. So you've got massive fuel loads. 2017, they lost 10,000 homes. 2018, they lost 20,000 homes and 100 dead. And that's firefighter heaven. You can have as many fire engines, as many firefighters, as many aircraft as you want, and they can't cope. So we have Buckleys. So that's overlapping. The drying trend, there's been an 11% reduction in rainfall just in the last 20 years, and particularly on the South Coast. Now, and we're finding May to July rainfall up to 20% reduction. And that was when we used to do our hazard reduction burns. So it's too dry to be able to actually carry out a lot of burns. And so we either get heavy showers of rain that stop us from burning, or it's just too dangerous. And we're into the fire season by July anyway, so we can't do burning. I remember I was hazard reduction officer for the fire brigade and for the Blue Mountains at one stage. We used to burn up to October. You can't now because we're actually losing properties in August, which never ever happened before. Higher temperatures. 2019 was the hottest year on record. I think 2.52 degrees above average, which is an incredible number. It's usually fractions. We had a day in Sydney, 49.7 degrees, so just nudging 50 degrees. People said that would never happen. Well, it did. What that does, it increases evaporation. And so the fuel, you've got 20-year drying trend anyway. You've got much higher average temperatures. The extremes are far more extreme. When we talk about fire intensity and calculating it, there's a very simple formula, I equals HWR over 600. So I being intensity in kilowatts per metre of flame front, heat output of the fuel times the weight of the fuel times rate of spread over 600. And you come up with a figure of how many kilowatts per metre of flame front. So that's, sorry, boring, lots of information, but we talk about available fuel. So it's anything anything below about 6 millimetre thickness, say pencil thickness, we measure tonnes per hectare. But when you dry everything out, there's more available fuel because the fire doesn't have to do any heating and driving out moisture. So I don't know the scientific answer to this, but there could be up to 50% more available fuel. So 9 millimetre thickness rather than 6 millimetre thickness. That drives the intensity of the fires, and that drives convection, which, I'll talk about pyroconvection in a moment. We're seeing things my dad never saw, the fighting fires from 1939 right through. He remembers 1939. He used to tell me about lightning coming out of the smoke. But it's a bit like Legend of the Yeti. People would talk about fire-caused thunderstorms, but never actually seen them. Well, I think I saw about 10 this year. I'll get onto that in a moment. More days of very high fire danger and above. Just to give you an idea of this year, the average for spring in New South Wales since the 1950s is 2 days of very high fire danger or above. The record was 2002, there were 11. This year, there were 21 days in spring of very high fire danger and above. September the 6th has gone down in the history books, was the worst September fire weather ever recorded in New South Wales and Queensland. It was catastrophic, way above the MacArthur scale 1 to 100 was about 118 in Tamworth, I think. We had the fires really ran on that day and then just became too big to handle. The extremes are far more extreme. We're getting this catastrophic fire danger. So that's off the scale. We added that after Black Saturday 2009 because the old scale of extreme fire danger didn't describe what we were seeing. And we had to change our operational paradigm from stay and defend, you'll be okay, to no, you won't. On the worst days, you must leave the day before or you will die. You'll lose your life. And so that's why we've got catastrophic. That's why we've got emergency warnings. So now pyroconvection, just quickly on that, they're fire-generated thunderstorms. I haven't got time to go into the details, but it's all about unstable atmosphere. So if you heat the atmosphere, it becomes more unstable. Any gas moves more quickly. For the chemists amongst us, it's pretty simple, physics and chemistry. Heat it up, it moves more quickly. So movement between the layers. It allows convection columns from fires to go higher. It acts like a big chimney, draws in at the bottom, condenses at the top, forms a cloud. Those big cumulonimbus clouds, storm clouds, pyro meaning fire. So a fire-caused storm cloud. Now, the only trouble with these is they don't generally generate rain, but they generate the downdrafts, The wild winds, they can rip trees out of the ground like they did in Canberra in 2003, throw them around like toothpicks. They can lift up 8-ton fire trucks and drop them on their roof and kill firefighters, as happened near Canberra this year. It was absolutely frightening being out on these fires when these storms formed, because you didn't know where the wind was going to come from, and the wind velocity sometimes knocked you off your feet almost. These are the sort of conditions that you just can't deal with. Between 1978 and 2001, there were 2 recorded events in Australia. Since 2001, there's been 78. There appears to have been a 33% increase in these in 2019, and up to 45 additional events since September 2019. This is, no one would have believed this 2 years ago if you tried to tell them this would happen. It's impossible, but it's happened. So we've had the worst fire weather, the worst fire conditions ever experienced. And I'm an old hand now, like my dad was. Dad used to talk about the 39 fires, the 44 fires, the 57 fires. These were something totally different. My friend Ken Pimlott, the fire chief from California, went over there and talked to him about their fires. He's shaking his head. We're seeing things we cannot explain. So, look, I'm mindful of the time, Peter. I don't want to take other people's time, but we've changed everything in the fire agency. Some new fire danger rating systems. We had to bring in emergency warnings, the primacy of life, leave early rather than no, stay and defend. Large aircraft after 2009, we had to try something, but aircraft don't put fires out, people on the ground do. But if you can't get close to an intense fire, you can't do anything. So we try to get a tactical edge with these aircraft. But so what it comes down to, resilience. Rob was saying, it's being able to take a hit and then to bounce back. Now, this works at every level. The federal government, and look, I've been out and about. I don't want to get into political arguments or personal arguments. That's a feature of today's politics, is hatred, which I find really disturbing. Each party hates each other, individuals hate each other. The disrespect that's shown, and it's on the international stage. While I was in California, President Trump talking about the Californian governor and saying they should rake their forests so they're getting no disaster funding. And that was almost as good as drinking disinfectant, but at least we're not that bad. But so I'm not going to enter into that sort of argument. We tried to warn the federal government, but we mentioned climate change. They didn't want to talk to us. But it's very clear, the science is clear, there's no question. Climate change is warming the atmosphere, which is leading to worse and worse natural disasters. So if you've got a pot boiling over on the stove, you can mop up the water all you like, you can put a lid on it. You actually have to turn the heat down to make any difference. So our government, with every other national government in the world, needs to try to dial down the heat. They need to take real action on emissions, because there is no question it's human-caused climate change is leading to these unprecedented conditions. I'm worried about my grandkids. We have a moral obligation to them to do something. State governments, when I was in Bateman's Bay, the power went out. So mobile phone coverage soon went down, no emergency warnings. We had no mapping. Our radios went down. We had line of sight simplex radio and we freelanced. Refrigeration went down. And people couldn't get food deliveries for days. Very fragile, our supply lines, our logistical setups for lifelines, sewerage, everything. Once electricity falls over, everything falls over. And power lines strung up on telegraph poles is also a source of ignition. We should be, over the decades, putting them underground. That would be a huge resilience measure. Australian Standard 3959, building in bushfire prone areas, needs to be beefed up. The BAL's bushfire attack levels are too low. Prior to bushfire seasons, local communities should be getting together. Who needs help, who doesn't. I think we need buildings, maybe big sporting venues in small towns, but they act as refuges so that people can go there rather than be on the roads where they often die. And it really comes down to what we do as individuals to keep our homes and our families safe. And that's the start of being able to bounce back. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. That's very interesting. And there's many comments in chat, which I'm not too sure if you've had time to click through them, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go into many of those, because they're sort of discussions about hazard reductions and preparations and who did what to whom. And a lot of that is very important, but we haven't got the time today to do it. But that is kind of what this forum is about anyway, in the sense that what we hope to achieve here today is somehow start building the connectiveness of the community again, and also to try and let people understand how they can have the negotiations with government, be they local, state or federal or wherever, or even their own community, about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, because these discussions have to be had. So, I mean, there's a couple of questions in here, one of which was about what you were just talking about, what do people do. I'm just wondering if you've got any comments about the rebuilding process. Maybe that's of interest today, about what they might do, or how they might go about that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Look, I know, a lot of people will just want to build back quickly. My advice would be really think about and get good advice about how to rebuild. I remember going to Spencer and the Gospers mountain fire, and we had to protect all these homes, put in some tactical backburns, and it was a bit of a nightmare, side of a mountain. And this one particular home we got to, and it was hallelujah, huge water tanks, pumps, fire hose reels, sprinklers on the roof, shutters on all the windows, all of the spaces were closed in. And we were able to concentrate. We would have lost the house next door if these people hadn't built their home the way they had. It was way above spec, and it would have been hellishly expensive to build. But if you possibly can, that's a real resilience measure. If your home can be a refuge where you're going to be safe, you're going to have shelter afterwards. You won't have to get on the road to try and escape with a fire bearing down on you, because they'll go faster than you can. So, yeah, and look, there's another thing, your own fuel loads. There was a lot of argument about fuel reduction. It's essential, but you probably saw me on the news. There were politicians trying to say it's national parks' fault. They should have burned everything. They didn't. And there's no such thing as climate change. It's just fuel reduction. Oh yeah, and the arsonists. Oh yeah, and the greenies. They would use anything to deflect attention away from climate change. So we called them out on that. But there's an old adage in the fire service: what's between your back door and your back fence is your responsibility. Really, and that can be tough. I know I'm getting a bit older, and before I'd go out fighting fires, I'd always do the roof and fill the gutters and all the rest. And because I left my wife and kids more than once protecting our home over the years. But it gets tough. And that's where communities come in to help each other, but look after your patch. And when you rebuild, really think about doing above spec, because actually the standards are undercooked.
All right. There is another question here. It's kind of similar. but you might be able to put a different angle on it. We're told to prepare for the fire season. So 2 questions. What is the outlook for 2021? And how can we prepare for these events other than leave? Especially if they're going to go for...
Great question. So I'm trying not to be in the prediction business. So what I watch happening is we'll probably get a couple of East Coast lows. I think we're getting one this weekend. They used to be years apart. Now it's just about every June we get one or more East Coast lows now, another impact of climate change. There'll be a lot of rain. Everyone will go, it's wet, but it'll heavy rain. Most of it will wash off or run off, and it'll probably stop raining early July, late June, and then the westerlies will start maybe in July, and look, if we're lucky, around November we'll get the storms, which happened in 2018. We had a big start, but when the last year with the drought kicking in, we knew that there was no indication of that moisture coming through. I don't know. We shouldn't get as bad a year. The Bureau's saying above average, probably 80% likelihood of above average rainfall. Cross the fingers. I hope we have a year off, but it could just dry up very quickly. How do you prepare? Listen, if it's extreme or catastrophic fire danger and you're in a precarious position, please leave the day before. Head somewhere safe, head to a big town, to the city, head to the beach, because you don't want to get caught. Once the fire's coming, you need to shelter in place, because unfortunately, most people lose their lives while they're trying to flee.
Thanks, Rob. I think, Greg. We might call a halt to the questions there. Greg's got some plumbing jobs to deal with. And if you're still around, we'll ask questions at the end. You can let me know. But otherwise, thanks for your time and all the discussion.
Yeah, good luck, everybody. And yeah, thanks. And yeah, my resilience factor is I've got to go and dig trenches so that my family has toilets that'll flush tonight. So bye, everybody. Thank you. I can see you clapping. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
All right. We'll move right on now to Denis Ginnivan. Now, Denis is a community person that's worked in northeast Victoria with the Voices of Indine. He was one of the founders of that group. Now, they're a group that are interested in participatory democracy, and that means they bring communities together to discuss these types of issues or any issue that the community is facing, and they give them a structure and a process about how to go about it, so that whoever they're talking to in power or in their local community understands that it's a thought out position backed by the community and therefore has some credibility. So I'll hand over to Denis now and he'll take us through that process. Now, I realise the questions have been a bit short. I'm more than happy to stay here, and I'm sure Denis is as well, and answer as many questions as we can at the end of Denis's discussions, although I guess many people will move on because it is a long time sitting in front of a computer. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Denis and we'll see where we get to.
Thanks very much, Peter. Can I just check, Peter, what's the optimal amount of time? Because I can sort of curate it a bit to fit in with what parameters you've got.
Well, if you go for half an hour,
Yep.
And then we'll get into the questions and we'll see who's still around wanting answers.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Peter. And thanks to the Farmers for Climate Action for the opportunity to speak here today. I just also wanted to recognise some of the really important points that both Rob and Greg made around how, well, for Rob, how we are as people, what our needs are, and what our wiring's like, and how can we, what happens when there's a debonding, but also a regrouping and a sort of a sense of where to now. So I guess that's partly where I'm coming from in this presentation is what is it that communities, so individuals and communities, obviously it's got to be in a group to get sort of action, but what can an individual and a community do to refocus, regroup, to build a sense of future common purpose? And that's what I'm doing with my little business called Events That Matter, which is supporting rural communities to have stronger voices around issues, many of which may have been mentioned today. And I should say I'm really conscious that, you know, the difficulties that we face today more broadly have become a bit more sharp when you've got two big events, fire and pandemic, and the double whammy effect, which is happening for the South Coast, Bega Valley. But I should say, just by way of experience, and it's sort of relatable, and that is that in northeast Victoria, which is where I'm from, there's been major fires coming through this region too, and there's quite a bit of work going on in the communities that were bushfire affected. And I should also say that from a personal perspective, my farm was in a bushfire that totally got burnt, except for the house. So there's something that happened. I was quite lucky. I wasn't on the property at the time, but I'm really conscious of what I have a sense of what it is that people in this presentation and the audience here may have been through. I appreciate there's a lot of trauma and perspectives that may not be ready yet for, you know, sort of talking about what to do next. But with respect to that, I'll present it, but I'm conscious that it may not be where everyone's at. But I want to, in effect, give you a bit of a case study example of the federal seat of Indi, which is in northeast Victoria, made to towns Wangaratta, Wodonga, Benalla in that region, and then all the valleys up to the hills from there. And I'm going to be speaking about how rural people and communities can connect with politics and have a stronger voice, how our representatives can be stronger in representing the people, because they need a strong community to be listening to do the job. So the focus is on improving the relationship between the community and the politician, and it's for them to do their job, and it's a two-way street. So I'll draw on my experiences in northeast Victoria with this group, this community group, which was formed in 2012, Voices for Indi. And also since that time, there's been 3 successful federal independent campaigns. So this region's had quite a move towards the concept of a community and a representative being more directly connected without a party structure around them. So really, in a way, the community technically, or sort of essentially, is the party, because there's not a formal party telling that politician how to be, or that parliamentarian how to vote, and how to determine policy positions based on a broader position of the party. So I'll draw on that experience, but also working with emerging community democracy groups in other parts of the country, and also on my experience with Total Renewable Yakandanda. And I just should say it was interesting hearing Greg speak about fire, but one of the big things that's happening with regard to fire resilience with the country fire authority is actually starting to, and it's happening in this region. It started in this region actually, where CFA buildings are going to be more renewably sourced energy. It's that sort of becoming a one way in which emergency services and communities can start to protect themselves from reliance on grid power alone. Just very quickly, a couple of acknowledgements. I'm not a member of Voices for Indi committee now, so I don't speak on their behalf, but I've had a lot to do with the work that it's done, and I encourage you to go to their website, which has got a lot of information about how a community over time has influenced the way in which politics has emerged. Also, the Victorian Women's Trust develops some pretty innovative ways in which people can have positive and effective conversations, bringing people together. It's known as kitchen table conversations, and there's a report on the Voices for Indi website that captures a lot of the model and content of what happened here. So briefly, the challenges that can face any community, and as I said, I'm speaking, in a sense from a case study perspective, are many. One is, for example, to use the AFL, Australian rules football analogy, there's more members of the Richmond Football Club than there are in all the political parties combined, is what I understand. So what's happening over time is that there's more and more of the decisions are being made and being influenced by, from a party perspective, by a smaller and smaller number of people. It's been difficult, if you're not a member of a party, to find a way in which people can participate in the political process. And I should say I'm speaking broadly, federal, state and local. There's a sense of disengagement when certain groups of people or cohorts don't feel that there's any connection for them. And one of the really big worries that I have is the increasing rate of disengagement by young people and connection with politics. And politics was sort of becoming something like what gets done to me in my name, rather than what do I do to shape it. And that's really one of the things that's the essential message that I wanted to get across today is what can one do? And it's all, this has been in the sort of context too of the, the sort of the game or the paralysis of polarized party politics on key issues. And obviously what we've been speaking today is one where there's been so much polarization without the community actually being listened to, I believe, around big issues like climate. So there's this thing called, what I used to do was I'd be shouting at the television, because of being disconnected myself and didn't really know how do you even participate in all this. You'd see something on the news, you'd be cranky. And I realized, well, that's not very helpful, is to be sitting at home throwing a metaphorical brick through the television and not doing anything about the issue. So that's really what has happened in this region. Is the big question is what can I do? What can I do to be on the front foot and feel positive about my community, the way in which we're being represented, the opportunities to get involved in some way, to bring other people along for the discussion. So in a way, the voting positions and the policy positions taken tend to reflect what it is that is being felt and expressed by local communities. And citizens, under a democracy, we all have a right and a responsibility to be part of it. It's our gift. It's something that's to be valued. It's something to be used in a positive way, to be feeling, well, the other options aren't looking too flash. If you're looking at other forms of government, then what we've got is a massive opportunity to participate in what it is that happens around us. And I know that sort of may sound idealistic, but at the same time, it is our opportunity. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through some key things. So I guess what happened in the region where I'm from is there's been a big shift. And I guess what I wanted to say at this point is that if you want to follow up any of these ideas or opportunities or thoughts around what I'm saying and what I will be saying, please direct them via Peter and back to me if it's me. I'm more than happy to sort of follow it up, because I just wanted to get in that now early before too many people have to leave, Peter. So really, what does it take? What does it take for a community to become stronger in this? And I should say, this has got nothing about being anti-party. It is pro-community. And it picked up on some of the threads that Rob was saying before too, is that, what it is that people feel emotionally strong about is things can get out of hand. But this isn't to blame anyone directly, but it's also to exhort and find the ways in which community can rise and become stronger, and it becomes, in effect, part of the political process the community does. So in our region here, the key things were there's a small group of people got started. They started asking questions. What can I do? What's the possibilities? Who do I know? Can we keep talking and having conversations to just get started? So essentially 10 people got together and started asking those questions of themselves, and over time things emerged from there. And I mentioned that report, which is on the website. There's been lots of other things that groups like Voices for Indi have done, but that report's a pretty good example. It involves people who become concerned about key issues, but also want to know how the system works, how you are represented now, and how you could improve your way in which you could be represented on the issues that matter to you. Such a group may bring people from a variety of groups and views, some of which you may not, everyone's got a view that not everyone else is going to agree with. But if there's an acceptance and a respect and a courtesy about listening to people with different views, then larger groups of people can get together and form a common strategy. So that's really one of the bedrocks of the process of bringing people together, is that you've got to be prepared to understand, take on board, work as a broader community rather than have a sort of sense of personal commitment and passion about something. Such a group would be bring those people together. Voices for Indi did that. They actually became an incorporated body, so it wasn't the individuals who were expressing the voice. It was actually a collective position that then became what it is that was in the media and in the community, and sort of publicly speaking about the opportunities to engage in citizenship. They wanted to create a community, a voice of aware and engaged citizens, to see that your representatives' actions are aligning to your local community's expressed wishes. They've talked to the neighbours and friends about this, and we're opening to listening to others' opinions, as I said before, about a wide range of issues, not specifically only a single issue that is often what may drive someone. And as I said, it's not about being anti-party, it is about being pro-community. It's not about getting rid of somebody, but it's actually being a process that can actually assist current forms of government, or if it isn't working, to become the basis for subsequent further action, where a community might decide, well, if we don't like the politics that we've got, maybe we can get other sorts of politics. And I guess that's what's happened through Indi, is that there's been a much stronger relationship between the community and politics, and much more of an invitation for people to participate in that dynamic between the community and the politician. And the MPs, they need strong local groups to talk to, as I said earlier. They need, in order to improve their capacity to represent, they can't ignore the community, and particularly if that community is organised, respectful, productive, engaged, and representative of a broader group of people. So there's things that groups like that can do. They can invite guest speakers in, bring people together around particular topics, project invitation to people to become more involved themselves rather than just listening to speakers. And I think that's really one of the key things is to sort of have to imagine what the future could look like, and then have a sort of a sense of how could we get there if you wanted to do something like that. And for each community is very different. They need to consider their own factors that are in play in those communities. So where you live is going to be different to what happened in Indi, but I guess I just wanted to sort of put this possibility in front of you as part of the resilience building, strengthening of a rural community after some fairly serious and challenging times. I think how people can work together and express themselves as a collective across a larger region is so important, and maybe these ideas can help you think a bit about how you would like to react to it in your own community. So Peter, I might stop there. I'm conscious of the time. More than happy to take questions or to follow up after the meeting is finished. As you go, Peter.
Thanks, Dennis. And before everybody leaves, we will have some more questions. And Wendy, Cohen, our CEO at Farmers for Climate Action, is going to wrap up. I'll just ask one question because it might give you an opportunity to explain how to go about the answer to this question. And it is, like 2 cents worth, Bega and surrounds needs to find the things it has in common with Tumut, Tumbarumba, Gascoigne, Kerma, Ginnivan. Because it is a huge, where did it go? Because it is a huge and diverse seat with slightly competing points of interest. So have you got a comment on that or how they might go about doing that, Dennis? I guess from my point of view, they go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, well, I think what unites people is often a common challenge. I wouldn't say common enemy, but a common challenge or a common sense of broad purpose. So, you know, there's always differences between parts of the region. I don't downplay the differences between the coastal and the higher plains, the narrow plains sort of areas, for example, as having different interests. But I think in the bigger world, that's one electorate, for example, Eden Monero, it's one part of a much bigger picture. So how that broader picture gets represented in Canberra is what could well be the commonality. So I agree with you that there's individual differences between the towns, but I think it's important, for example, I remember in some of these kitchen table conversations we're having, it sort of became obvious that it's really important that what's important to other people is equally as important as what's important to myself. Like there is a bit of a give and take, you cut a bit of slack and actually see the world from other people's perspectives as well. So the conversations that would capture this reflects that sort of value of hearing out people who may be very different to you and understanding how the world looks to them. So as the discussions come forward, it captures one's awareness of someone else rather than I just want to get my issues put on the table. So there's a lot behind that, and the processes and the psychology of the sort of facilitated meetings that can help bring that out in people in a disciplined and respectful way. So I hope that answers it. Well, from my perspective, that's my best attempt to do that, but I do appreciate there's so many elements to it.
Right. Well, no, that's good, Dennis. We might just do one more question, then we'll go to Wendy, and then people can ask. We'll stay here and answer questions for as long as people want to ask them. But other people can move on to whatever they need. So the last question is, what do you do when it appears that some people want victory and the last word, even in completely minor things, which is kind of fundamental to organising these groups?
Well, one of the things is that one of the shaping aspects of that is that membership of groups like this and discussion groups, but also a group that might decide they want to actually take on board, you know, a broader strategy. What happened with INDI is that we had a really strong commitment to a sign up of values. And there's this famous observation that just because you got values doesn't mean you're a pushover. You know, like the community group, by doing so, by everyone signing up to a process or signing up to membership, would be asked to sign up to the principles or the commitment to being respectful, transparent, listening to someone else, being open, working towards a positive outcome. So in effect, for a community group of that nature to get together, there's got to be some way to draw together people's commitment to the larger than it is to the individual. So I think if there's a person who's just wanting to have the final say on everything, it may not be many people following them. because
Yep.
it won't fit into like a broad commitment by a group to work together.
Thanks, Dennis, for that. Now, I'd like to call on Wendy Cohen. Wendy's ready.
Thanks.
To give you a wrap up, and then I'll probably come back to you, Dennis, and we'll answer any further questions. Thank you.
Sure.
Wendy.
Oh, look, thanks, Peter. And thanks so much, Dennis. Really interesting stuff. We've had some fantastic speakers today covering a range of topics. We've heard of the challenges that we face together as a result of climate impacted weather crises, and these are significant and really confronting and likely to continue if nothing changes. But as Dennis has just outlined, working together, communities can create a unified and really powerful response and help build resilient and sustainable rural and regional communities across the country. Look, some ways you can get involved, and I'm sure that you're sitting there listening to these really wonderful, informative, inspiring chats to you is probably bringing some questions to the fore. You know, what can you do? We've got some really practical ways that you know, you can consider. So you potentially form community groups, networks and structures to take action in your local region, and this includes using some climate smart practices and principles, and FCA is always really happy to chat to you about those sorts of practices that you can use closer to home. Reach out to your friends, your neighbours, your workmates, and really build a network, spread the word. Engage with your elected representatives at all levels of government and really help change the politics. Farmers for Climate Action also has some yard signs available, so please get in touch with us either via Facebook or through info@farmersforclimateaction.org.au. These signs can be a great conversation starter on your street or around your property, and a really powerful way to spread the message. So just some easy practical steps to kickstart the awareness and the conversation in your community. Thanks again to our incredible speakers and presenters, and thank you all for participating and having interest in this and being really committed to making your communities resilient, connected and thriving. And thanks, Peter, for bringing this all together and making it happen. Back to you.
Thanks, Wendy. Right, so that's kind of the end of the formal section of this webinar.